Henry Muller held a significant position. He served as the intelligence officer for the 11th Airborne Division, or G2, as it is known in the military. His regiment was battling fiercely on the Philippine island of Luzon as 1944 came to a close. His task was to obtain the information required to alert the division about the Japanese forces it was up against. He once had a conversation with a Filipino plantation owner who had just journeyed all the way to Luzon to acquire medicine for his ailing wife from Manila. It was an excellent opportunity to find out where the opposition was congregating and what they were doing. Muller started the interview by asking a few questions he knew the answers to in order to make sure the man was telling the truth. The Japanese had accomplices among the people of the island nation. When he was finally content, he started asking the farmer other questions, such as the man's journey route. A few minutes later, the farmer said, "I passed that large POW camp." Muller was shocked since he had never heard of a camp like that in the region. "Which camp?" he inquired. According to the farmer, it was crowded with American people, including women and children, and was located at the former Los Baños Agricultural College. Manila was not far to the south. How many inmates were at the camp? Muller inquired. According to the Filipino, I'd say about 2,000. Muller became even more shocked. He was unaware that so many civilians were being detained so near the action. He gathered as much information as he could regarding the location and conditions of the camp. He then wrote a report for Lieutenant General Joseph M. Swing, the commander of his division. The revelation did not surprise his boss, who instructed him to relay the information up the chain of command and not to worry about it because it was not close to their area of operations. Muller followed instructions, but he went beyond. According to the Filipino, the population were in poor condition. A liberation mission might be required, and paratroopers were almost perfect for such an operation. He started collecting whatever he could find about the camp, its environs, and its defenses in silence. The 11th Airborne would be prepared to respond like the cavalry in a Western, if the chance to save lives came up. 40 miles southeast of Manila is the little Filipino town of Los Baños. The former grounds of the Agricultural College of the Philippines were located on the outskirts of town. In February 1945, about 2,000 American civilians were dying from starvation on these grounds. The American troops appeared to be far away, but they were in dire need of assistance. Built in an area with tainted water, rice paddies and wetlands infested with malaria, and no drainage system, the camp opened its doors in 1943. Disease was spread by bedbugs and lice infestations. To make the water drinkable, it had to be heated after being transported from far-off wells. Electricity was non-existent. 800 male internees, primarily chosen by random, constructed the camp. Through 1943 and 1944, the majority of the inhabitants were transferred from other camps, like Santo Tomas, to this one. The Japanese desired the Americans to be separated from the general Filipino population. The locals continued to provide food and clothing to the internees and occasionally assisted them in escaping, despite their encouragement to despise the Americans as overthrown imperialist overseers. 2 additional small communities, Mayandon and San Antonio, were located close to Los Baños. To the north of the communities was Laguna de Bay, a huge freshwater lake. The Americans controlled the other side. On the lake, Mayandon Point was prominent and offered a viewpoint for surveying the region. Alongside a railroad, National Highway 1 passed through the settlements as it went from west to east. The college's sporting field served as the location for the camp. There were a few streams and gorges to break up the level terrain surrounding the camp. The land was covered with vegetation. To the southwest was Mount Makiling, a 76-foot-tall dormant volcano. The camp measured about 600 by 800 yards, or 60 acres. It was encircled by a double barbed wire fence, the inner being 4 feet high and the outer 6. Sawali mats were used to cover sections of the fence. These provided camouflage but not protection from shrapnel or gunfire. On the northeast side was the main gate, while on the southwest side was a smaller one. There were 9 log and dirt guard posts scattered throughout the surrounding fence. To the southeast of the camp was a 9th. Within the main gate were the commandant's headquarters, the barracks, and the armaments room. There were 26 barracks buildings with sawali mats for the walls and wood frames with niepce palm roofs. Each stood on a concrete slab and measured 30 by 198 feet. The numerous priests, nuns, and missionaries were housed in the Holy City, which was located in the southwest section of the colony. Hell's Half Acre on the northern end was where the remaining prisoners resided. A sawali fence separated the two areas. The concrete structures and cottages of the college, which served as housing for Japanese troops in transit, were situated outside the camp. At the time of the rescue, they were vacant. In fact, Major Tanaka, the first Japanese commandant of the camp, had been fairly lenient. In addition to being a Buddhist priest, he came from a samurai household. He cared about his charges' well-being, and even permitted them to occasionally travel to Manila to buy food with their meager resources. He was eventually replaced, but Major Urabe, who took his position, was likewise comparatively kind. Despite the challenging and cramped conditions, the camp authorities did not appear to want to make their suffering any worse. When Major T. Iwanaka, the third commandant, assumed command in July 1944, everything came to an end. Humanity was replaced with cruelty, and things quickly got worse. Iwanaka seemed to the internees to be suffering from what is now known as dementia. He delegated the daily management of Los Baños to Warrant Officer Sadaki Konishi, a subordinate. Both appeared motivated to cause the internees as much pain as they could. The inmates had some hope, though. The Americans were fighting their way into the camp after landing in the Philippines in October 1944. While traveling to Manila, they witnessed bombers flying by and air fights taking place in the sky above. Good-natured Filipinos brought food and news about the campaign with them. Some internees were able to get radios that were concealed from the guards' ears and much more closely listened to. In the last day of 1944, many U.S. as Navy fighters screamed over the camp. The prisoners were thrilled to see American planes, but did not express it on the outside for fear of retaliation from the authorities. The camp documents were set on fire by the Japanese guards a week later. The guards abruptly handed the camp over to the inmates' executive committee the following day. The inmates were shocked by this development and prudently decided to stay in camp out of concern for the consequences of encountering a roving Japanese army unit or Filipino collaborators. They were too feeble to go too far, however. A handful of the infamous Japanese military police, known as Kempeitai, showed up later in the day but did little more than shut down the main gate. Another American landing occurred in the Lingayen Gulf, 160 miles north of the camp, on January 9, 1945. In the same way that the Japanese were desperate to resist, the civilians were yearning to be saved. After 5 days, the guards came back in even worse shape. Major Iwanaka soon started conducting surprise searches, lowered rations, and enforced a rigorous curfew. Tyrannical Warrant Officer Konishi increasingly refused medical supplies and meals. As they awaited a rescue they believed would not arrive in time, the internees gradually became weaker. 1 or 2 more inmates perished every day. American troops launched operations to rescue the thousands of civilians and prisoners of war detained in facilities throughout the island shortly after they landed. There was increasing concern that those still in the Philippines would be killed by the fleeing Japanese, as many had been transported to Japan as slave labor. There were 2 successful rescue operations in January and the first part of February. In the first, on the evening of January 30th, a small group of rangers teamed up with Filipino rebels to free prisoners of war at the Cabanatuan camp. What has come to be known as the Great Raid resulted in the rescue of about 522 people, while the Japanese sustained significant losses. Another mission to liberate the Santo Tomas camp in Manila was launched on February 1st. Troops of the 1st Cavalry Division traveled 100 miles in 66 hours, considerably ahead of the main American assault, with men mounted on tanks in a flying column. Guerrillas helped them get to the camp, where they negotiated the guard forces' withdrawal and were shortly taken prisoner themselves. 3,700 internees were saved by the column. The Los Baños camp was now the main focus. With thousands of Japanese soldiers nearby, it was still well behind the front lines. Following a seaborne operation in January and a parachute assault intended to trap local Japanese soldiers, the 11th Airborne Division, was in the region. By early February, the division was able to approach Manila's southern suburbs thanks to this operation. The Jinko Line, a Japanese defense belt dotted with machine guns, bunkers, and cannons, was where the Americans encountered it. The Cavite Naval Ammunition Depot was taken on February 21st, after weeks of fierce combat to secure the area. The 11th Airborne collected the intelligence required to organize a rescue operation at Los Baños while fighting the Japanese. According to their best estimate, there were 2,130 inmates. They estimated that 250 people were bedridden and that half were too weak to move. 12 Navy nurses were the only military personnel in attendance. It was fortunate that the inmates themselves were able to provide more information. A few inmates would cautiously slip out of the camp each night to look for supplies and food. They looked for information on the American advance while foraging. Typically, there were more rumors than food. According to Filipinos, the U.S. Manila was on the verge of collapse as the army approached. On February 12th, Freddy Zervulacos, a prisoner, went out and made contact with Filipino guerrilla leader Colonel Gustavo Ingles. Ingles was preparing for the rescue effort by scouting the region. After providing the guerrilla officer with information regarding the conditions in the camp, Zervulacos went back to update the executive committee. The committee discussed options but was afraid of Japanese retaliation. The inmates were instructed not to get in touch with Ingles ever again. However, Zervulacos and 3 other people, Ben Edwards, Jack Connors, and Pete Miles, broke out of camp on February 18th and met the guerrillas at a predetermined location. Their goal was to reach American lines and request help. A banca, a canoe-like vessel with outriggers, was used by the insurgents to transport Miles across the lake. Miles reached the command post of the 11th Airborne the following day. He informed them of the guard stations, sentry routines, and the positions of the camp's machine guns and their fields of fire. Aerial reconnaissance had failed to locate some of the guns because they were camouflaged. Notably, the majority of them were positioned to shoot the inmates rather than protect against outside threats. In order to confirm the escapees' tales and gather intelligence, a comprehensive reconnaissance of the region was the next step. On February 20th, the engineer platoon leader and the divisional reconnaissance platoon leader crossed the lake together. Although their objective was difficult, it was essential to the rescue's success. In order for the paratroopers to land, they needed to find a drop zone, DZ. For the attack, the DZ need a path the Americans could take to reach the camp. The 2 officers were also tasked with identifying the locations and extent of the guard posts and other camp fortifications. The lieutenants joined some Filipino guerrillas and 2 of the American detainees once they were on the other side of the lake. They quietly made their way around the camp's perimeter, taking note of the fortifications. 2 potential drop zones were discovered. One was located south of the camp, but an easy route to Los Baños was blocked by a creek. The other, measuring 1,500 by 3,200 feet, was easily large enough and located northeast of the camp. To get to the camp, a paratrooper would need to travel a few hundred yards at most. A few dry ditches and stream beds were also present to give the attackers cover. Although there was no power in the region, this DZ did have a train track along its northeast side and a set of power lines along its north corner. Pathfinders and pilots would be able to view the DZ during the drop because to this boundary. The division staff was able to formulate comprehensive arrangements once the American officers returned across the lake the following day and reported their findings. The real rescue strategy was bold and creative. Although there were dangers, it was impossible to predict how long the prisoners would be held before being put to death by the Japanese. At the same time, 20 miles west of Los Baños, the 11th Airborne was still fighting hard against the enemy. Nevertheless, preparation proceeded, and a unified operation quickly developed. 3 components would make up the rescue force, each with a crucial duty to play. A group of paratroopers was the first to land on the camp and take it away from the Japanese soldiers. Local Filipino guerrillas and personnel from the Divisional Reconnaissance Platoon would support them. Before the raid, the recon guys would use bancas to traverse the lake. The guards would be killed or driven away. The inmates would be gathered, and they would begin to move toward the shore. The second would be an infantry battalion in amphibious trucks, or DUKWs. In order to save the weaker prisoners a lengthy journey back across the lake to American lines, they would cross the water, pull up onto the beach, and proceed to the camp to pick up the civilians. Eventually, amtracs, amphibian tractors, replaced the DUKWs. In order to divert Japanese attention from the rescue, the third group was a task force the size of a battalion that would approach the region overland. The strategy would be implemented by these three organizations in 5 stages, some of which would take place concurrently. The initial stage was reconnaissance of the camp and mission planning, which was already underway. The reconnaissance platoon would join the guerrillas in Phase 2 and guard the drop zone and landing beach. They would also murder the guards. The airborne drop and attack on Los Baños, together with getting the inmates ready for departure, would comprise Phase 3. Phase 5 was the diversionary offensive from the west, which was intended to drive any Japanese reinforcements away from the camp. Phase 4 was the evacuation of the inhabitants to American-held area. In addition, there were several contingencies. There were hurried preparations for the guerrillas to attack the camp if it seemed the Japanese were about to massacre the inmates. In the event that an evacuation across the lake was not feasible, the internees might also be evacuated using the diversionary force. The attack was originally planned for late afternoon, but it was rescheduled for 7 a.m. due to concerns about the upcoming executions. The guards who weren't on duty performed their morning calisthenics at this time as well. They would lock their firearms in the camp arms locker while they worked out. The constantly changing intelligence picture caused changes to occur quickly. Nevertheless, the 11th Airborne was able to adjust to the new situation with ease. Attached units of various types supplemented the battalions chosen to serve as the mission parachute infantry. To make the parachute drop and attack the camp, B Company of the 1st Battalion, 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 1511, was chosen. It was a standard airborne infantry company consisting of 3 rifle platoons and a headquarters under the command of First Lieutenant John M. Ringler. Each platoon consisted of a mortar section and 2 12-man rifle squads. With 93 men available, the company's strength was 73%. In spite of its size, B Company was the regiment's strongest unit. The company was bolstered by the battalion's machine gun platoon, which at the time had 28 soldiers, and a 9-man engineer squad to lay up roadblocks. There were 134 men in all, including 3 Filipino rebels who volunteered to jump and 1 war correspondent who was believed to have attended the mission. Instead of waiting for the battalion to assemble as a whole, the company would parachute down and attack the camp by platoon. They would assemble and prepare the prisoners for evacuation once they had eliminated any opposition. By crossing the lake in bancas, the reconnaissance platoon would sneak into the area and establish positions around the camp. They would help with the assault and mark the landing beaches and drop zones. Guerrillas from other factions would accompany them. The rebels received supplies, weapons, and ammunition to help them in their endeavors. Planning was overseen by Lieutenant Colonel Gustavo Ingles of the Hunters ROTC guerrilla force. The local guerrilla leaders respected Ingles, thus he was able to overcome any obstacles. To find out if the guerrillas could capture the camp and free the internees without the help of American forces, a meeting was convened with them on February 10th. They questioned if the paratroopers could be removed from the front line in time to prevent the alleged executions. Because the internees would be too frail to go to the American lines, the guerrillas had no way to evacuate them, even if they thought they would be able to take the camp themselves. Until the Americans arrived, the rebels lacked transportation and were uncertain if they could hold the camp against counterattacks. It was agreed to try to wait for the American invasion, but with the proviso that the guerrillas would launch an instant attack to rescue as many detainees as possible if they saw the Japanese murdering them. There was another worry among the insurgent leaders. The local Filipino population would be at danger even if the prisoners were successfully freed. Whenever a guerrilla action occurred, the Japanese frequently responded against local civilians. The majority of the guerrilla leadership was concerned since they did not know when the American offensive would take control of the region. In order to keep the Japanese units cornered and unable to retaliate, Colonel Ingles eventually allayed their anxieties by stating that he would suggest attacks against them following the raid. Ingles visited the camp to monitor it on February 13th. He also had a meeting with George Gray, the former secretary of the camp committee and a recent escapee. They talked about the guard stations, the guards' daily schedules, and the worsening conditions within the camp. The following day, Ingles was ordered to deploy a patrol to the shoreline to make sure the terrain could sustain the weight of cars. Additionally, they would inspect the route leading from the camp to the shore. The night of February 16th was the date of this patrol. After his return to the American lines, Ingles met with the personnel of the 11th Airborne. He stated that although the guerrillas could take control of the camp, they most likely wouldn't be able to repel a Japanese counterattack. The United States included the 11th Airborne. Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger, commanding the 8th Army, spoke with Major Dave Vanderpool, the intelligence officer, about the strategy. The ability of the guerrilla troops to gather and move through the region undetected or betrayed was questioned. In order to concentrate on the joint airborne and amphibious attack with the assistance of the Filipino forces, they chose to halt the unilateral guerrilla campaign. It is unclear why, but at some point in the later planning phase, amtracs were used instead of amphibious trucks. At any rate, the amtracs were somewhat better protected and had deeper cargo compartments. Additionally, they had more .50 caliber machine guns than the average DUKW unit. Amtracs broke down more frequently, so losing even a handful could leave the mission without enough vehicles to convey everyone, so it was a dangerous move. The chosen unit was the 602nd Amphibian Tractor Battalion, which had fought since September 1944 at Bougainville. It was outfitted with a 3-person crew and a 24-foot-long tracked vehicle called the LVT-4, which had a gasoline engine that produced 250 horsepower. The feeble internees would find it much simpler to board the LVT-4, thanks to its rear ramp. For the mission, the battalion had 54 amtracs at its disposal. In order to assist in securing the area, the other 2 rifle companies of 1-5-11 would travel on the amtracs. Task Force Soule got its name because Lieutenant Robert Soule was in charge of the diversionary force. The 188th Glider Infantry Regiment, minus its 2nd Battalion, made up this unit. As the Task Force Reserve, the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment's 2nd Battalion was also assigned. Fire support would be provided by 2 artillery battalions, the 472nd and the 675th Glider, both of which were armed with 105mm howitzers. With the addition of Company B from the 637th Tank Destroyer Battalion, the column gained mobile firepower. A company of combat engineers and a detachment of bridging engineers completed the American force. Soule's battalion was also accompanied by numerous Filipino guerrillas from the Hunters ROTC group. There were Japanese soldiers all over the place. Although American intelligence activities identified many of their positions that threatened the rescue, planners were able to address them. Even the captives did not know the precise number of soldiers in the camp's guard force, which was thought to be between 150 and 250. The majority of them were elderly guys who were either recovering from illness or injuries, but the American strategists had to presume they were seasoned veterans. When the men who weren't on duty reported for exercises in the morning, the guards would switch shifts. There were numerous additional Japanese soldiers in the vicinity. Just west of Mayandon Point, a 20-man detachment atop the Los Baños wharf with 2 70mm cannons covered the lake. As the amtracs crossed the lake, these guns might put them in jeopardy. About 3,000 yards west of the site was a rock quarry. There was a company-strength force with 2 howitzers and 4 machine guns. A unit of 80 soldiers and 2 75mm guns was stationed as a roadblock along National Highway 1 more than 6 miles to the west. The Soule Task Force encountered this force. Although there were several Japanese patrol boats cruising the lake, the amtracs did not believe they posed a serious threat. With 1,000 soldiers, the Japanese 8th Infantry Division posed the biggest threat to the rescue team. This seasoned force, which consisted of 2 infantry and 1 artillery regiment, operated in Manchuria from 1939 until 1944. The 8th would take hours to reach Los Baños, but after learning of the crisis and receiving orders, one of its battalions was able to reach the camp in 90 minutes. The 8th Division might jeopardize the operation's overall success if the rescue was postponed. On February 19th, B Company was removed from the line and transported by truck to New Bilibid prison, which is likewise situated on the Laguna de Bay beachfront, marking the start of the operation despite the dangers. After a day of relaxation, the men received an update on the rescue effort. They had differing opinions. Some believed it was a suicide mission and did not mind stating so, while the majority recognized the significance of this for the inmates and felt privileged to be chosen for the endeavor. 3 Filipino guerrillas, 1 for each platoon, were adopted by the company during the combat in Manila. First Lieutenant Ringler was asked by a sergeant if the guerrillas could participate in the operation. The 3 Filipinos had 3 hours of parachute instruction after Ringler gave his approval. The following day, 2nd Lieutenant Walter Hettinger's battalion machine gun platoon arrived. Planning proceeded while the organization got ready for its new mission. The actual written orders for the operation were later developed solely for historical documentation because changes happened so quickly that very few written orders were even prepared. The command staff and division staff believed the goal was still worthwhile, despite the significant dangers. The task of transporting the paratroopers for the drop fell to the 65th Troop Carrier Squadron on the 20th. The squadron, commanded by Captain Donald Anderson, was outfitted with Douglas C-47 Dakota transports that were stationed at the adjacent Nichols Field. It was nonetheless deemed competent of carrying out the task, even though it had last dropped paratroopers during training operations at Fort Benning, Georgia, prior to its deployment overseas. B Company received parachutes and was assigned to the planes in 15-man sticks after being trucked to the airfield in the late afternoon of the 22nd. Some of the men armed the local guerrillas with submachine guns and extra ammunition. A map of the camp and a report on the most recent developments were sent to each man. In order to delay any Japanese that arrived quickly, the accompanying engineers were also instructed to set up barriers close to the camp. Additionally, the men were told that their leap would be at a significantly lower altitude than the typical 1,200 feet. Rather, they would leap between 400 and 500 feet, which would bring them closer to the earth and faster. Only roughly 25 seconds would be spent in the air from this height. The reconnaissance platoon, led by 1st Lieutenant George Soule, started penetrating the Los Baños area on the evening of the 21st. For the 3-hour journey across the lake, Sergeant Martin Squires led a squad of 5 scouts in Bancas, while Soule led a group of 3 of his scouts and 3 war correspondents. 2 hours later, the remaining 23 soldiers of the platoon departed aboard a big banca fitted with sails. The unit's heavy equipment and machine guns were also transported by this vessel. But that night, the winds blew against them. Scou's troop arrived just before daylight, after 8 hours of travel, while Squire's soldiers arrived 10 hours later. At a schoolhouse, they met up with the local guerrillas and got ready for their mission. The big banca was still not here. The platoon was supposed to split up into 6 teams, with 6 to 8 guerrillas assigned to each team. Just prior to the planes passing overhead, the squad led by Sergeant Turner would indicate the drop zone with green smoke. The amtracs landing beach would be marked with green smoke and secured by Sergeant Leonard Hahn's unit. Teams led by Soule and 3 sergeants, Robert Angus, Vincent Call, and Cliff Town, would destroy the guard positions on the camp's north and west edges. The guard post at the main gate would be personally attacked by Soule's crew. Someone else would breach the fence and take control of the weapons room. While a radio man led a different team to cover the south, Sergeant Squires' team, reinforced with 20 guerrillas, was tasked with attacking the guard posts on the southwest side. They also found and added a couple escaped inmates to the teams. The big banca with the remainder of the platoon finally arrived on the evening of the 22nd. It had been becalmed and stuck in the middle of the lake. Fortunately, they had gone undetected by hostile patrol boats. The soldiers disembarked from the boat after dark and received a briefing on the strategy before departing for their posts. There has to be silence. The Japanese might begin executing the prisoners if the American troops were found. Even if they were shot at in the dark, Soule instructed them not to shoot back. In the bush at night, sentries frequently fired at sounds. Task Force Soule was getting ready for its mission as the scouts took their positions. Bridge replacement and maintenance occupied the attached engineers. After arriving, the Hunters ROTC guerrillas were tasked with protecting Soule's flank. On the American side of the lake, the 652nd Amphibian Tractor Battalion also formed up. Throughout the night, the division officials continued to collect information while the combat soldiers waited. A Northrop P-61 Black Widow night fighter flew over the area at midnight and reported seeing hundreds of truck headlights heading east toward the Los Baños area and then heading back. Additionally, some insurgents informed the staff that 3,000 Japanese reinforcements had arrived. After taking these changes into account, General Swing made the decision to proceed with the scheduled operation because altering it would disrupt the meticulously planned schedule and result in the individual units arriving at different times and being unable to support one another. Later, it was discovered that the reports were exaggerated. Numerous American movements had been identified on the Japanese side, but incorrect inferences were reached. When the Japanese saw Task Force Soule, they assumed it was the major assault. To wait for it, they dug in. Although stated, the Amtrac battalion was evaluated as tanks assisting Soule in his assault. The Japanese did not appear to have anticipated the amount of work that would be required to rescue internees. The camp's guards spent the night in ignorance of what was ahead. When the soldiers assigned to the Amtracs loaded onto the vehicles at 4 a.m. on February 23rd, the attack officially started. Major Henry Burgess, who oversaw the entire operation as the commander of the parachute unit, was on board one. Also on board was the Amtrac battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Gibbs. The entire 54 Amtrac force moved into the lake around 5:15, forming 3 columns of 18 cars each. Using handheld compasses and estimates of the distance traveled at their speed, they made a southward turn at 5:50. This was dangerous since the crews were accustomed to bringing troops and supplies ashore from transports, but they had no experience traveling great distances. The strategy was successful, and at 6:20 they made a little adjustment that left them headed for San Antonio's beach. They had their first glimpse of their goal as the sun rose. The paratroopers and the Amtracs noticed how low the planes were flying when the 9 C-47s carrying B Company suddenly sped overhead. There was enough light at daybreak for the pilots to see the features of the area surrounding the camp. In order to indicate the drop zone for the pilots above, Sergeant Turner's scouts below set off their green smoke grenades. Lieutenant Ringler was standing in the lead plane's door. Additionally, Sergeant Hahn's crew lit their green smoke for the coming Amtracs that had almost flawless navigation at the landing beach 2 miles from the camp. During the 74-minute journey, not a single Amtrac broke down as the unit split up into 9 columns of 6 vehicles. Guerrillas and scouts rushed forward to guide the cars to the route. 2 jeep-drawn 75mm pack howitzers loaded on the Amtracs, and 1 platoon from a company sprang off to secure the beach. As the remainder of the amphibious assault moved near Los Baños, the American artillery promptly intervened when the Japanese guns on Mayandon Point started shooting at the force. At 6:58, B Company received the order to leap as the Amtracs rolled ashore. One by one, Ringler's troops followed him as he leaped out the doorway. The journey to the earth was brief because of the low altitude. After removing their jump straps and retrieving their crew-served weapons from the drop bundles, the paratroopers prepared to attack the prison guards and liberate the camp. Several of the scouts arrived with only minutes to spare, after battling their way through deep creeks and dense vegetation to get into position on time. In the dark, Squire's crew had become separated from the insurgents that were with them. A villager's dog attacked one of the insurgents just 15 minutes before the attack. The whole crew froze in place, waiting for the Japanese to react, as he pulled out his pistol and shot the beast down. Unbelievably, none arrived, so the crew completed positioning themselves. As the onslaught started, Sergeant Town's crew was also just getting into position nearby. One of the guerrillas was struck, but the bullet was fractured by his belt buckle, saving his life. They noticed 4 Japanese soldiers sprinting across a field in front of them as soon as they heard gunfire coming from the opposite side of the camp. PFC Robert Carroll fired his bar at them, filling the magazine in a single long shot. The conflagration destroyed all 4 enemy soldiers. The crew continued their assault, spotting another Japanese man scuttling down a ditch and shooting him as he attempted to flee. As the Americans began breaking the wire to enter the camp, the majority of the guerrillas fled to pursue the Japanese who were running away. Several more teams arrived late but joined right away. When the firing began, Lieutenant Scow's crew was still a few hundred yards from the front gate. Without taking any losses, the team raced through the gate with the platoon's lone machine gun. They proceeded to the armaments room and took control of it. They gunned down several guards along the way. Remarkably, instead of sending the off-duty guards immediately to the armory for their weapons, the Japanese soldier in command of them told them to go to their barracks to put on uniforms after they had just gathered for their morning calisthenics. It was a deadly error. While B Company was still landing close by, the remainder of the reconnaissance platoon was soon involved in combat with the Japanese guards. From a position north of the main entrance, Sergeant Call's crew was subjected to machine gun fire. Additionally, grenades were thrown at them. One of the pieces struck a man in the nose. Despite Call being struck in the shoulder by the machine gun, the crew continued to advance, firing at camp guards. The sergeant called B Company to fire some 60mm mortar rounds on a bunker near the main gate, where he saw some guards hiding. The group also used grenades to attack the bunker. The remaining squads entered the camp and began shooting the guards, many of whom appeared to be aimlessly running around. While others clambered into ditches or attempted to reach their own barracks, others hid in prisoner quarters. Some, including an officer who attempted to leap through a window into the camp headquarters, were killed by Scow's crew as they made their way to the armaments room. Many Japanese, especially those without weapons, escaped into the surrounding buildings or the woods. To find the escaping men, the majority of the Filipino guerrillas split off from the American scouts and frequently used machetes or bolo knives to chop them to death. The Filipino people were retaliating against the despised Japanese for all that they had done to their nation. The majority of the internees were gathering for the morning roll call when the onslaught started. It didn't take them long to comprehend what was going on. Many people assumed it was a food drop when they saw the parachutes begin to emerge from the C-487s. Some reported seeing the word rescue emblazoned on the side of a Lockheed P-38 Lightning fighter as it flew overhead. The scene descended into chaos very soon. People started yelling, nuns started praying, and some went back to their barracks to get their possessions. Most sought refuge in the barracks or ditches when the bullets started flying, while some simply fell to the ground and laid prone. A woman saw paratroopers cutting their way in at the wire. She snatched up a pair of wire cutters, sprinted over, and handed them to the soldiers, thinking rapidly. B Company entered the fray and started contributing. The corporation was really fortunate, and the transition had gone well. The landing only injured one man, but it was not severe enough to prevent him from joining his fellows. Even the Filipinos, who had never jumped before, landed with the rest of the team. The lead paratroopers reached the camp in 15 minutes. The criminals were swiftly dealt with after only a few rounds were fired at them. The Americans began sweeping up the remnants of the Japanese resistance, which had never been genuinely organized. Few of them engaged in combat, but the majority were guards who would occasionally appear among the 2,100 civilians. The paratroopers shot them as they fled, although the majority were just attempting to flee. In order to rescue the internees and escape as soon as possible, the Americans were present. They spared the adversary, taking no dangers. The majority of the paratroopers began preparing the residents for the evacuation after the main fighting was ended. To get to their blocking positions, the attached engineers rushed down the road. To block the roads the amtracs didn't need to utilize, they set up satchel charges, planted mines, and felled trees. In case the Japanese arrived fast, a machine gun was placed above each barricade. Soon, rumbling sounds came from the lake's direction. Fearing that the noise was coming from Japanese tanks, some of the inmates grew alarmed. Rather, the main gate was opened by a lengthy column of amtracs. Though they were happy to find that they were American, none of the internees had ever heard of such a vehicle. After dismounting, the 2 infantry companies inside the vehicles made every effort to defend the area. While C Company erected additional barriers, the 50 men of A Company remained in the camp. The remaining amtracs parked on a baseball field and a few open areas outside the main gate, because only 6 could fit through the camp entrance. During the paratroopers deployment, an odd thing happened. Courtney Whitney, a colonel on MacArthur's staff, came out of an Amtrak with 2 of the Amtrak's crew members and an interpreter. They returned soon after carrying boxes of documents from their visit to the camp's headquarters building. Whitney claimed he was merely present to see the procedure. He was actually in charge of the part of MacArthur's staff that dealt with communication with guerrilla groups in the Philippines. The document's relevance is still unknown, and they returned on the same Amtrak. The civilians were in awe of the American soldiers' appearance because they had not seen one in 3 years. At first, some people didn't identify them. In contrast to the headgear worn at the start of World War I, they wore peculiar helmets. Instead of the khaki they were used to, their uniforms were a dark green color that was more akin to Japanese ones. Due to the atabrine they used to prevent malaria, several of the paratroopers had yellowish skin. The inmates were also unfamiliar with the rifles, submachine guns, and bazookas they carried. The paratroopers appeared to be enormous. Many of the civilians weighed less than 100 pounds, and they were all starving. All of the paratroopers were physically fit and in good health. They were taller than the people. The internees, who looked like nothing more than skin and bones, similarly astonished the American forces. Some were so weak that the paratroopers were scared to lift them up for fear of hurting them, while several were sick and only wore rags. Some rushed to the storerooms and kitchens to eat because they were so hungry. Others who had hoped to be rescued by Marines were unhappy to discover that their liberators were actually soldiers. The spectrum of emotions was broad. While some were ecstatic, others sobbed. Perhaps fearing the Japanese would return, others chose to hide or even refused to comply. They were clearly unable to travel the 21 miles to the shore. Fortunately, one of the war correspondents who accompanied them arrived because his sister and brother were internees in the Philippines. Almost immediately after entering the camp, he located them. Getting the people on the Amtracs and organizing them became the issue. Nobody was in charge, and the majority were meandering around. They were brought under control by Major Burgess, who also ensured that all of his soldiers were present. Lieutenant Scow reported at 07:45 that while all of his men were present, the majority of the insurgents had left to hunt Japanese. If the Japanese showed up, they would be useless. Ringler was pursuing the remaining few of his guys, and he knew where the majority of them were. Additionally, Burgess was unable to radio Division Headquarters or Task Force Soule. Although they could hear gunfire coming from Soule's unit, it didn't appear to be approaching. Lieutenant Colonel Gibbs requested freedom so that he could leave the internees and paratroopers to join Soule and return across the lake with his Amtracs. Burgess turned down this request. As planned, he would have to evacuate all of the internees across the lake in Amtracs. He would send as many soldiers and civilians in a single lift as feasible because the 54 Amtracs could not transport all of them in a single trip. Protected by a line of paratroopers positioned surrounding the beach, the remaining internees would have to wait for the second lift. The beach was on low ground, making it impossible to defend against a coordinated onslaught. The Amtracs might not return for 2 or 3 hours. Nevertheless, the paratroopers had 2 howitzers and lots of ammunition. There was nothing else to do, and it was possible. A fire that began in the headquarters building facilitated the process of moving the civilians into the Amtracs. Naturally, the internees were heading toward the parked cars and away from it. Ringler and the leader of the machine gun unit were instructed by Burgess to burn down the barracks and drive the inmates out. The intended outcome was achieved, and the parachutists immediately began assisting the weak citizens on board the transports. To make sure no one was left behind, a few men looked about the camp. There were just 2 losses, both minor wounds, and the rest of the B Company troops were accounted for when the remaining internees entered the Amtracs. With each truck loaded with released citizens and paratroopers marching alongside, the convoy left and made its way back to the shoreline. Filipinos gathered from the villages along the way, giving the Americans bananas and water. The camp had burned to the ground and was deserted. After a last sweep, the men of B Company were the last to leave. Many of the soldiers held infants, and a few stragglers were among them. Walking down the road, they walked past the bodies of the Japanese guards. As the parachutists executed their remarkably effective raid on Los Baños, Task Force Soule was equally occupied with deflecting Japanese attention. With its artillery, the task force started its mission by bombarding the Japanese in the neighboring hills and the rock quarry with shells. The soldiers moved forward, deliberately creating noise. To give the impression that there were more, the tank destroyers were always moving. To produce dust and give the impression that the battalion was a division, the vehicles pulled logs behind them. In order to facilitate the task force's easy withdrawal, Lieutenant Colonel Soule was meticulous in his clearance of the surrounding hills and bridge repairs. He now believed that after they met, the amtracs would leave with his force. On a nearby hill, some of his soldiers used their mortars and machine guns to support a guerrilla onslaught. The Americans were unsure whether the several Filipino bodies they discovered with their hands bound were those of insurgent collaborators or victims of those collaborators. The task force's diversionary attack resulted in the deaths of 3 Americans. As the amtracs loaded with internees arrived at the lakefront, the paratroopers surrounded the beach. It was time to relocate the civilians across the lake, but Major Burgess was still unsure if the Soule force would arrive. As 1,500 internees were put into the amtracs, the paratroopers dug in, knowing that the round-trip voyage would take at least 2 hours. It was 11 in the morning, the others waited. The cars arranged themselves into 3 columns and set out. The amtrac crewmen reacted with machine gun fire, soaking the beach and surrounding bush in a torrent of lead, while an odd bullet splintered past from the shoreline. Collapsing in on the perimeter were the paratroopers from the blocking positions. A few contacts with Japanese troops did occur, but they were minimal. Using a forward observer, General Swing made radio contact while flying overhead in an L-4 liaison plane at around midday. Swing was informed by Burgess that the inmates were crossing the lake. Swing was pleased that there had been so few casualties and that the operation had gone so smoothly. After the final internees were gone, the division commander advised Burgess to gather the remaining soldiers and join Soule's task group. Burgess did the only thing he could to avoid being told to do it after realizing it was a horrible idea. Disabling his radio, he proceeded with his plan. Fortunately, Swing probably realized his mistake and never brought it up again. The amtracs returned a little after 1 p.m. and loaded the last people, then the paratroopers. The pack howitzers were rushed to the shore by the artillerymen. 1 cannon was placed on top of a stack of luggage, while the jeeps and cannons were transferred onto different vehicles. Japanese fire intensified from the rock quarry and Mayanden Point. Aiming their weapon at the point, the crew of the baggage-mounted cannon fired. The amtrac was almost overpowered by the 75mm shell's recoil, and the irate driver threatened to shoot them if they attempted to fire again. Soule chose to retreat to the San Juan River, remaining on the close side in case he had to advance again. When the diversionary force noticed the captives fleeing across the lake, 50 Japanese forces launched a minor counterattack, but it was quickly routed. The first group was transported by trucks and ambulances to the neighboring New Bilibid prison, while the second group was transported by amtracs. Although the former inmates were surprised to be placed in cells, it was a joyful period. The people were given new clothes and evaluated by doctors and medics. Some went through the meal line 4 times after it was opened. The lunch included bean soup and fresh bread with butter to ease their delicate stomachs. Reporters strolled among them, photographing, interviewing, and recording the festive event. All of the civilians were united by 4 p.m. after the second batch arrived safely. The rescue cheered and applauded when the rescuing paratroopers arrived at the prison hospital an hour later. The airborne men were permitted to stay overnight and celebrate with the now free citizens after they all ate together. They ate breakfast and got into trucks the following morning. It was time to return to the battlefield. Task Force Soule was quickly relieved by the 15-11. When they progressed a few days later, they learned that 1,500 Filipino people had been killed by the Japanese in retaliation for the raid. Months later, Warrant Officer Konishi was apprehended and killed for war crimes in 1947. Major Iwanika got away with it. B Company's contribution to the rescue earned it a Distinguished Unit Citation. Today the campsite is a part of the University of the Philippines. Young couples can meet at the park with the fertility tree, a huge rain tree.